At this point, I would like to introduce Paul Babcock and John Dale. Paul joined Forks Community Hospital as CFO in 2017. He has been in hospital finance for more than 18 years, working in hospitals ranging from large urban medical centers to rural critical access hospitals. John Dale is principal of Wifley's Healthcare Facility and Capital Planning Group. With over a decade of consulting experience, he has worked across the country assisting healthcare clients to plan and finance new facility developments and renovations. It sounds like that's what may be going on in Forks. So anyway, with that, Paul and John, take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. You stole my thunder a little bit, in terms of being the prime spot on a Friday afternoon before March Madness games are going. So we'll try to keep this as short and interesting as possible. I feel like our presentation today is going to be different than probably things that you've seen in the past, and hope to keep your attention. If not, I have to apologize too, because usually when I have a mic in my hand, I'm doing some karaoke, and so maybe at the end, if there's time, we'll see.
You're not going to sing your speech?
Huh?
You're not going to sing your speech?
Well, we'll see. If people start nodding off, I might have to mix it up a little bit. If my pink shirt's not enough to keep your attention, we might have to throw in a little Sir Mix-a-Lot in there and see how it works. But anyways, today we're going to talk about a case study. Paul and Forks Community Hospital is one of Wifley's clients that we're currently working with. But I think it's a truly unique and interesting project. One of the things that I love about my consulting career is having the opportunity to work with clients like Forks Community Hospital, other rural hospitals that are, Hill Burton vintage age hospitals that are between 70 to 50 years old that are really in need of replacement. And one of the things that I get to do is help these clients develop a roadmap to get to that replacement facility. And the ones that I've worked with that have been fortunate enough to build something new that you can go in and touch and see, it's really something that I can't put words around it. It's very satisfying from a career perspective. And so when Forks Community Hospital reached out to us to say, we're in a hospital that is 70 plus years old, and when Paul took the job as CFO, the board member said to him, how do we get a new hospital? How do we get a new hospital? And then after many years of kind of spinning their wheels a little bit, they reached out to us, and we have been fortunate to work with them over the past several months to really help put out a master plan to get them to a new, hopefully a replacement facility, and also help them finance it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through that story. A little bit about Forks Community Hospital. It's a public health district hospital, district of Clallam County. It's a critical access hospital that was established back in 1949. A little bit about the base statistics. It has 17 acute med-surg swing beds. About 13 are staffed today. They also provide labor delivery services for mothers. And they also have 20 long-term care beds. These are not currently in the swing bed model. They are truly long-term care beds. And 17 of those are staffed. If you want to add any color, Paul, feel free to do that.
Yeah, and it's a wing of the hospital, and it is something that's been of great importance to the community, and is something that is always difficult to talk about and difficult to broach as a subject, because there's a lot of defensiveness in the community about this is our resource and we need to protect it, and that's a little bit of what we've been facing over the years.
Right, and we'll talk more about how those long-term care beds have been impacting the hospital finances and how it has been impacting their affordability to build a replacement facility. We'll get into that as we discuss debt capacity. But they have about 4 family practice providers, and they do have some general surgery and some orthopedics. And so a little bit of background on the hospital to get to level set everybody. A master plan is fundamentally a roadmap for how to plan and eventually build a new building. And in this case, the goal was an onset, a replacement facility. So what you see in front of you are some 5 basic steps of a typical master plan that a company like us or anybody would employ. A lot of times hospitals, when they think about building something, will contact an architect first. They think, for whatever reason, when we want to build something, let's call the designers first, without really going through the due diligence of the steps that are outlined here that are very important before any architect is contacted. It's like if you were to build a new house, like when you go and build that house, you don't contact a builder first, you don't contact an architect first. Usually you would go to a bank or a real estate agent to really figure out how much you can build, how much you need before you look at a contractor. And so that's what we're recommending as part of this process, is that you really do the feasibility and the front end work first. And that's what we've articulated here for you, and what we're going to go through and show you the results of for Forks Community Hospital. So we start with the market analysis. Really, what are the opportunities in the market? What are the growth and the demographics? There's a utilization forecast predicting what the future volumes are going to be in the future. The third step is really understanding the facility itself. What are the major issues with it? What are the problems? What are the infrastructure issues? The fourth step is debt capacity. That's like when you go to a banker and say, how much can I afford to build? How much can I afford to have debt from a mortgage perspective? That's similar to what a debt capacity is. And then the last thing is, once you understand what you can afford, then you look at options. Is replacement on the table? Or do we have to look at smaller, cheaper options like adding an addition or some internal expansion, internal renovations? So you see here, these 5 steps really are iterative. They make sense. They build upon each other. And we're just going to go through some of the examples of what we did for the hospital. Before we do that, some of the things that we came upon for this hospital is that basically it was very much taxed from a space perspective. And so given Paul's comments regarding long-term care, the hospital had very limited financial ability to really reinvest in the facility. And given that inability to put dollars back in, there were a lot of issues that were ongoing over the past 50, 60 years. A lot of piecemeal solutions, buildings built in residential areas, a lot of buildings that were not added directly part of the hospital. So you get a lot of this expansion, right? A lot of this kind of, I call it a Frankenstein-like hospital, where things are bolted on as needed. And over time, that just starts to have an impact, and we'll go through the what that looks like today and what are the negative implications of that. But then also, the fact that Forks Community Hospital, I don't know if you guys know, but Forks is the setting for Twilight, the Twilight series. And so...
That's why I'm out there, because I'm actually part vampire.
But he's Team Edward, and I'm Team the other guy, and so...
Shows how much we've
Jacob.
watched it.
So we get into arguments once in a while, settle them over beers at the end of the night. But this hospital is in a very remote area, and so one wouldn't think that they would have a lot of opportunities for growth, but actually, it's by the Olympic National Park. There's really great tourism and things like that, and the population in that area is actually growing, and they're the sole provider there, so they command the market share. But also there's leakage. There's leakage to their nearest competitor, which is over an hour away, which is a PPS hospital. Mm-hmm. But they're experiencing success in that they're kind of treading water, but there's opportunity to really thrive because there's some organic growth in that population, and there's opportunities to capture more market. So we started with a market analysis, and the first thing that we look at with the market analysis is really defining the service area, where the patients are coming from. And if you look at just this map here, you can see where Forks Community Hospital resides relative to their major competitor, which is Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. And you can see it's very much kind of isolated, and it's not easy to get to. I've driven there a couple of times. Flew here and then drove to Forks, and it's a good 2.5, 3 hour drive, depending on how fast you're.
From here, it's 3.5 hours.
Yeah, 3.5 hours. Yeah, depending. I guess it's skewed because some people tell me I drive like a grandma, but I just want to keep it on the road. But you have to drive around some lakes and things like that, and so it's not the easiest place to get to. So the fact that some people are willing to leave the Forks community to get to Port Angeles means either they really want an alternative or they want to go shopping or something like that. But the fact is, there is some loss and outmigration of market, and we'll talk about that. But the population here is growing. This is something that we like to see for all of our rural hospital clients. A lot of them are in areas that are actually flat to declining. So the fact that they've experienced, about 1% change per year over the past 5 years is a very positive sign. And projections are that it's going to continue to increase over the next 10 years out to 2031. So if they did nothing, they would experience growth just because the population is growing. And that's something that we really like to see. The age of the population is slightly younger than state and national averages, which was surprising to me. Most of the time, rural areas are much older from a population demographic perspective, but like every population base, that 65 plus population is expected to increase significantly over the next 10 years. And when that happens, that population base utilizes at a rate 4 to 5 times that of the normal of other patients, and so you're going to see increase in demand for hospital services. So as we look at the inpatient market trends, which in the state of Washington, there's really good data on inpatient. We can understand how many inpatients are being generated by any amount of zip codes or counties and where they're going. And you see Forks Community Hospital on the top line has hovered around 35% market share, which is okay, but typically we like to see a hospital in the primary service area capture about 50 to 60% market share. And if you can see there that Olympic Medical Center, their main competitor, is the one that's basically taking those patients where the outmigration is occurring. And if you look over time, their market share, Forks, has actually dropped 5.8%. That's a red flag for us. So that means that market share for the patients that are in their backyard is declining. So patients are leaving the service area to receive services. And that's also very symptomatic of hospitals that are older, that they don't convey quality when you walk in. I mean, let's be honest, when you walk into a facility and it's 50, 60 years old, it's very difficult to really portray that quality of care, even though you could have the best care in the world. When the buildings are old and tight and debilitated, it's very difficult to portray quality care in older facilities. Like I said, they have 4 to 5 providers, and the providers that they do have in general, in my experience, many of these providers are below production benchmarks in terms of the patients that they see. So a lot of times it can be difficult to see or access a provider at Forks, even though it's a small community. And it's because they just, doctors that move out there, they don't want to work as hard as if they were to work in Seattle, right? They're not churning through 24 or 30 patients a day. They expect to see something beneath that. But Forks is very typical in that regard, and that the providers that they do have, while they are productive, they're not as productive as like MGMA benchmarks might indicate. So that indicates that it can be difficult to see a provider. But then also, we ran a physician demand analysis to really look at, well, based on your community size and the age of that population, how many providers should you need? And based on our analysis, in primary care alone, they're short about 5 providers. And it can be difficult to recruit in this area. So the fact that their providers are underproductive, one, and the fact that there's not enough providers based on our analysis indicates that they need either their providers they do have to be more productive, or they need to be successful in recruiting new doctors. And that's difficult in
and just
an
to
older facility.
speak a little bit about that, we in late 2017 we lost our OB. He decided to go to another organization, another state, and it took us really a year and a half plus to recruit and get another OB there and functioning and up and running. In the meantime, we had to drop out of DISH, so we lost out on some money there, and there was just nothing we could do. We could not get another OB provider. It's very, very difficult to recruit into the area, just the nature of where it's at. But as you'll see some slides a little bit later, the facility and the age of the facility is also contributing very strongly to our ability to recruit in a bad way.
Right. And doctors and extenders coming out of school, unless they're from that community, they will look at the technology and the facilities that they're going to be working in and make judgments on whether or not they want to build their practice there, whether or not they can build a career there. And so having facilities that are 40, 50 years old really puts you at a disadvantage in recruiting in provider space that is already lacking in supply count. And that includes nurses too. So really something that we felt needed to be shored up if they wanted to remain competitive on the recruitment side. We did an analysis on their market share for primary care, and we basically calculated how many primary care visits we would estimate would be generated by a population of their size based on those zip codes. And we were estimating that they had about 87% primary care market share in the primary service area, which is very strong. Anything you see in the 80% is very strong. So they were capturing most of the visits on the primary care side that were being generated. However, our conclusion that we took away from this is that if we don't do something, we can probably expect the primary share market share to start to erode as well, along with the inpatient. So it's kind of a more defensive stance. So once you have high market share like this, we have to keep it high. We can't allow that leakage that's currently happening to Port Angeles to really invade into the primary care space, because if that happens, then really hospital finances could be impacted, because primary care is the blood of this hospital. So we took all that information, and there was obviously a lot of work that went into this, but this is an example of the inpatient demand analysis for beds. We did an analysis that basically looked at historically how many beds would this hospital need, and given opportunities for growth in market share and the demographics. Currently they have 12 beds total on the inpatient side, and we were projecting a need for up to 12 on the acute care side going forward under that pink bar. And so basically we did not project significant need for additional beds on the acute care side. And this is this is the case in many areas. But if you look historically, they're only at about a need for about 7 beds. And so we did feel like there's significant growth potential for utilization of those beds, not necessarily adding more beds. Because right now, if you look at the inpatient unit, you have a daily census of what?
2 to 3.
Yeah. And so we're projecting that they're going to have an average daily census more like 8 to 10. So a lot of opportunity to capture. On the emergency room side, we projected that they probably need to add 2 additional emergency rooms. And a lot of this is related to inability to access primary care. If you can't get into your primary care doctor, you're going to go to the emergency room. But so there's kind of a chicken and an egg thing there, but we're projecting that they need to add a little bit on the ER side. Their surgery and endoscopy counts were okay with where they were at. Their procedural layer is relatively new, something that they just added. So, but this is all part of trying to create the basic makeup of a new hospital, right? How many beds are you going to need? How many ORs are you going to need? How many ER bays are you going to need? So that's the future volume forecast. The next thing that we wanted to get into was the facility assessment, and that's really trying to understand what's good and what's bad about Forks Community Hospital. this is a critical component of any master plan, because when you go to the board or go to the community and say, we need a new hospital, the first thing a lot of people are going to ask is why? What's wrong with the hospital that we have today? Especially in rural areas that are reticent to change, the first thing that needs to be done is documenting exactly what's good and what's bad about the existing hospital. And really, that's what this existing facility state does, is look at, are the departments in the right spaces? Is there good design? Is there enough space? Does it provide good customer service? Is there off-site potential for some of these departments? And then basically force prioritizing all of the departments and seeing where are the major problem areas for the hospital. And unfortunately for Forks, the list was long. Yeah. A lot of the issues that they were faced with. But if you look, for example, at this 50,000-foot view of their campus, you see the hospital in the middle of the floor plan there, and they're very tight. They're basically you see parking lots to the right and left, but there's some open area to the back there with some trees, but the campus itself is pretty much maxed out. And because of that, when they needed to add space, they would move things out. So you look at administration to the bottom there, all of their administrative services, Paul's offices, Sarah's offices are all in that administrative building that are not in the hospital.
Which is an old house, actually.
Their primary care clinic is Bogachiel Medical Clinic, which is the upper left. Ideally, that would be directly attached to the hospital, so you're not making patients cross the street. You have behavioral health services. West End Outreach is behavioral health. That's across the street. Ambulance Garage is across the street. DSHS Community Services, that's where they're planning on putting therapy going forward, because therapy is maxed out. So what you see is sprawl. They've run out of space. So they've done what they needed to do by acquiring more. But obviously, it's not ideal. It's because they're maxed out on their campus.
Yeah.
You look at this floor plan here, and it shows you the vintage, and the lighter the color blue, the older it is. And this is not typically how we would want to do a plan, because if you look in the center of the hospital, that's where all the oldest space is. It's basically landlocked on all sides, and they've built newer spaces around it. And when you do that, you've really locked yourself in, because you can't go back in and renovate that internal space without creating havoc and phasing issues throughout the rest of the hospital. Usually what you do is isolate the oldest part of the hospital, build in one direction, so that you can eventually take out the oldest part and build new on one side. But the way it's been done here is all the renovations have occurred around that core, which has really limited future expansion options. So this is what really pushed us towards a replacement solution. We went through and also documented who owns what space and attributed zoning to each of these departments. So we went in and looked at who owned what space, assigned a type of space to them, and then we did a zoning analysis. And so if you look at the aqua colors, these are the diagnostic and treatment areas, which are highly outpatient. And typically when you look at a zoning map, you want light colors to be next to light colors. You don't want outpatients going through your inpatient space. You don't want outpatients going through your support areas. And if you look at this floor plan, it's basically a rainbow. And that's not what we want. We want more aqua next to more aqua, all that red next to all the red, and all the pink next to all the pink. So this is a problem, right? Because you have outpatients basically walking through every part of your hospital. And it creates wayfinding issues. It creates privacy issues. And so this is another reason why it really pushed us towards a replacement solution, because there's not really any way to change this without gutting and completely screwing up phasing and completely screwing up your current operations, because you're just not going to shut down to be able to renovate.
And before you leave that slide, just a point where the main hospital entrance is, and you see that little pink area, that's admitting. And it is so small, I mean, I think of it like a postage stamp. We've got one person in there, even just to expand to two people in there, it has been a challenge. And then when patients are coming in, if there's someone, at the admitting desk already, the other patient, there's not a lobby. We don't have a lobby. There's a place for them to sit. That's it. I mean, it's nothing compared to any other hospital I've ever been in.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And then we, documented all of the major issues that they're having here. The therapy is maxed out. There's lack of storage. Storage is in all the hallways everywhere. Patients are in still semi-private rooms. The long-term care unit, which is in gray, is in a very bad state. Basically documenting all the red areas are high priority issues that need to be addressed. And we have some yellow areas that are medium priority issues, but you see that they're spread out throughout all of the hospital. And so it's really eye-opening to see. We did some evaluation, kind of like consumer reports, to look at each of the departments and rated them, and so that the board and anybody that could read this report could really have in one location understand why these departments have the problems that they do. And then what a very important part is quantifying, is really saying, okay, you have this much space today. If you were to build it new, based on the volume that you're seeing, how much square footage would you need? And if you look at the bottom here, right now they have about 62,000 square feet. If we were to build it new with private beds, contemporary sized imaging, ORs, things like that, they would need 82,000 square feet. And then if you add in growth on top of that, if you add in expanded ER, more beds, things like that, they would need up to 90,000. So the gap there is about 28,000 square feet. That's a lot of space. You're not going to build that on the existing campus. And so again, this really pushed us towards a replacement hospital solution as well.
Yeah, and I felt that this part of the process was really eye-opening for us, because we knew we had trouble with space, because every time, you try to add an FTE somewhere, you're always in these discussions of where do we put this person, where do we put a desk, and, how do you move stuff around. Anytime, a service needs to expand, or even if you're, changing a service, or cutting a service, it's, the space is already called for, and there's competition for the space, but seeing just how bad it was really eye-opening, because it was something where you realized we can't just put another Band-Aid on this. We can't just, maybe if we add another, 3,000, 4,000 square feet, it'll help. That earlier slide that showed the DSHS building, we just purchased that recently, and we're going to, as John said, we're going to put rehab over there, but that's partly to alleviate the space, but that doesn't solve the ultimate problem, that we're out of space in the building.
And the quantification of that shortage is very important, because when you go through a process like this, there's always going to be people questioning why, and how much. And this documentation process, I feel like, is critical, especially for district hospitals. If you're going to go to a vote, anything like that, people ask these very detailed questions. And if you don't have the breadcrumbs, the trail of breadcrumbs to really kind of rationalize the decisions that you make, then that can throw a monkey wrench in your process. So as we were going through options then, we obviously were looking more at a replacement facility. And as we looked at the replacement facility options, we came up with basically two options. And this is just kind of summarizing current. They have about 47,000 square feet. The benchmark was about 68,000 square feet. So we came up with basically two options for replacement. The first was a bridge campus strategy, where we just said, well, let's take, because at this point we hadn't articulated or quantified exactly how much they could afford to build yet. So we wanted, it's kind of like when you go out and look for a home, you look at maybe a starter home at first, and then you look at what your dream home might be. So that's kind of an analogy for this. The bridge campus is like a starter home. What do we need to build to make it a critical access hospital and relocate all essential services to that hospital in the cheapest way possible to take advantage of the critical access hospital reimbursement. The other is the dream home concept, where it's consolidated, basically taking everything that they have and moving it all into brand new space, and seeing what the price differences were between the two strategies. So The Bridge Campus strategy ended up being about 59,000 square feet. So that's leaving a bunch of the admin and support spaces in existing hospital space, and then just building out a new inpatient wing, new diagnostic and treatment, and some other critical services. Versus the consolidated campus, a brand new campus, everything was about 86,000 square feet. So it was a variance of about 26,000 square feet there. And then we priced it out. So as we looked at how much it would cost, and that's a major issue that we're experiencing right now is escalation. Like with inflation, construction cost per square foot is escalating on a daily basis. So those of you that are thinking about doing projects, the sooner that we get these things in the door, the better, because it's just getting more expensive every single day. But our Bridge Campus option came in at about $58 million for a replacement facility with the kind of bare bones. And then the consolidated or the Dream Home option was about $78 million. And after we came up with this pricing, we ran a debt capacity analysis that Paul's going to talk about next. But to basically the debt capacity, if they did nothing, was only about $20 million. So that was a big red flag. And then obviously there's a big gap there, right? Between $38 to $57 million is a huge gap if we don't do something differently, fundamentally, to improve affordability. So now Paul, as the CFO, is going to talk about what are the things that we looked at in order to bridge that gap.
All right. So am I hitting this right? So, I knew, pretty soon after I got there that, you try to figure out what can you do, and not just for building, but for lending to get new equipment. And that was really one of the first things I got hit with when I got in there. It's taken us a while to get to the point where at the end of 2021, we managed to get into a good enough position to do a almost $17 million bond that addresses many of our equipment needs. This is a revenue bond. It refunded an older bond that for about $4.5 million that we were saving some money on by refunding it. But the other pieces were HVAC, boiler, and a whole bunch of other equipment that's long overdue. The HVAC system, 50 years old, and it was a true Frankenstein system. It had 8 different phases. They didn't work well with each other, and every time we went from hot summer to cold fall, it was about 2 to 3 days in the hospital. It was absolutely unbearable in the hospital while the system was kind of correcting itself. And the same thing had happened, from the winter when it went from cold to warm again. The same thing had happened. It'd be about 2 or 3 days. It was absolutely unbearable. Sometimes in the summer, the HVAC wouldn't be able to keep up, and it doesn't get that hot out there. Boiler, another thing. The hospital had an analysis done more than 20 years ago on the facility, and the boiler at that time was identified as at the end of life and needing replacement. We're finally 20 years later on 50-year-old boilers getting them replaced. So that kind of tells the story of what's been happening. The other part of it was I knew, you could see in the books and in the asset lists that investment in the facility stopped, around 15 years ago, and everything was starting to age out. We had systems that the software would no longer be supported, and on a particular machine or something like that, and we'd have to immediately replace it, and it'd be very expensive and really quite shocking. Compared to some other hospitals, district hospitals in the state. We don't have a big tax base, and it's an impoverished area. We do have the ability to levy taxes, but we can't do that much, So really with this last bond, we kind of came up to the most that we could do with a revenue bond, and that too is a patch, right? And we only have on our debt capacity the ability to raise about $20 million from taxpayers on a bond. That's obviously not nearly enough. So it leaves a big shortfall, and how do we close that? A lot of you know that some of the nice hospitals that have been built in this state have been done through USDA funding or through HUD funding. But in order to do that and get over this debt capacity issue, you have to have a revenue bond to do that. And the problem we had is that, we'd been treading water for years. We'd make some improvements. We'd have one year where, we made $300,000 in the black. That was a great year. The next year we were $275,000 in the red. So it was really difficult when you're in that situation. Okay, you need a revenue bond, but how are you going to pay for that? USDA doesn't just give you the money and you don't have to pay for it. It guarantees it, but you have to pay for it, and you have to find a way to do that. So one of the things that had been happening all these years in the community is the hospital had long-term care. And even though we had hardly anything going on in the hospital in terms of bed usage and swing bed usage, we had a long-term care unit of 20 beds that was full, and we knew it lost money. There's a state cost report for long-term care for the nursing homes that's done every year, and occasionally that would be presented in finance committee, or the result of it would be presented in finance committee. It's a long 100-plus page report, so you're not going to go into depth on that. But there was nothing, in our financial packet, our monthly financial packet, to show the board this is how much money we're losing on it. And after a couple of years, I got to the point where I'm like, we've got to show this to the board. We've got to make it clear to them year over year what's been happening. And by 2020, it really reached a crisis point. By 2020, the cost, it escalated so much. So you can see on this slide, what's going on is what we get from the state is a little under $240 per bed per day if they're a Medicaid bed, and that doesn't include some of the private pay that get in and then don't pay. But our costs are $620 per bed per day. That's high. And what's driving that? The big driver is labor, of course. And what we had experienced 5-6 years back and previously is, we staffed well, but we didn't actually pay our staff very well. We weren't paying our staff, they were paid decently for the area, but we weren't competitive in the market. So we would churn staff a lot. We'd churn NACs, we'd churn LPNs. They'd come in, they'd be there for a while, they'd leave. We had a few nurses and a few staff that had been there for a really long time, and then we had a lot that had been there for only a couple of years, and there was really nothing in between. So that told a story. We spent the last, starting in 2017 negotiations, and then in 2020 union negotiations, we really got back to market. For years what we had done is we had said, well, we have great benefits, and we do have great benefits. We have better benefits, I think, than a lot of our peer hospitals. But that argument started falling short with union members, especially those that were just a single person. They were getting the same insurance at any other place, so we weren't that competitive on that. We got to market wages. We really worked hard at it. We brought the wages up. Even in between union negotiations, we wound up having to raise wages for NACs because we were losing them, and we couldn't keep them. So but that loss, that loss of over almost $400 per day per bed, that translates in by 2020. That translated to a $2.3 million loss in the long-term care. So the hospital the hospital struggled that year, but underneath it is this gaping hole that's just been draining cash, and it affected operations because the reason we hadn't been investing in capital year after year is because we didn't have enough money. We didn't have enough money because long-term care was draining cash away, and no one was bringing that out to the forefront, and trying to address it. So we started with that a couple of years ago, and that's kind of part of what took us on this journey. As John alluded to, when I first got there, I was asked by board members, by the CEO, how are we going to get to a new building? How are we going to get to a new building? By the, a couple years ago, I started, showing the long-term care numbers and saying, well, we're not at a new building, and this is why. And this is why it hasn't been figured out before, because this is the piece that's been draining us. So I worked very closely with Eric Prosser at Whipley, and he did an analysis to figure out, kind of what we could do and where we have opportunity. The biggest opportunity that we have really is with this. We have these 20 beds, but when you look at the hospital, we're practically empty. We have 17 beds that are under our call license, but we're actually approved for 25, like the rest of you. And we're running a census of 2 to 3. The highest maybe 3 or 4, but usually 2 to 3. So we've got capacity there. So the switch that we're going to try and make here is to reduce down to 16 beds, convert those to custodial swing. We'll still be providing the care, and it's still going to be primarily Medicaid and some self-pay. But then, because that's all part of the hospital, this will be under our hospital license, and we will pick up $1.8 million in cost report reimbursement. And that closes that gap. So it's still not all the way, but it makes a huge difference. Once we do that, and we're in that process, then we actually can afford a new building. Then we're at the point where we can get the funding and actually pay for the funding going forward. And I think this is it's a big challenge for us, because in the community, this has been a bit of a sacred cow. It's a resource that years ago used to be 36 beds. It got reduced around the early 2000s down to 20 beds. People are still upset about that in the community. It is full. We can't, there's no possible way that we can meet the demand, but at the same time, expansion, we have no way to expand it, and it doesn't make sense to expand something that's your biggest money loser. It will only deepen the loss and threaten the future viability of the hospital. And one of the questions we've had too is, what if we do nothing? I mean, new building is nice and wonderful, but what if we do nothing? And just hold on? Then long-term care will finally close the hospital. It will do us in. The capital that we've gotten to replace a lot of stuff, some things like the boilers and the HVAC we're not going to need to replace soon, but a lot of the other capital, you look down the road, 7-8 years, we're going to need it again. So where are we going to get the money? And the only way we can get the money is through revenue bond, and the only way to do that is if we pay for it, and we can't pay for it if we can't make enough money to stay in, to get in the black and functionally have a way of paying for it. Meanwhile, as you all know, we're all feeling the pain of labor shortages. So we've gone up significantly in our wages in long-term care because we had to. But looking forward, we're all facing nursing shortages, staff shortages, wages going up, and of course we have a wage reopener with our unions this year. So we know we're going to go up again. That the driver of the cost is only going to get worse, and the reimbursement just doesn't keep up from the state. So we have a solution. It's a good solution, and it is a way of getting us into a building, a new building. The good news is that we actually have the land. More than 15, 20 years ago, the CEO and CFO at that time purchased more than 30 acres of land that's behind our Boga Shield clinic. So we do have the land to start with, which is a great situation to be in. This is a picture of the hospital. You saw the top picture of the hospital. This is what it looks like. And, I think most of you will have the same reaction that I did when I went there, like, oh my gosh, this is falling apart. This is not what you see most hospitals as. A lot of the community members don't see it this way. They see it as this is the hospital. It's an economically depressed area. It rains 150, 160 inches a year. So, you're always dealing with wetness and what that does to wood and paint and everything else. But, when you're recruiting for a physician and you're recruiting for staff, this is what they see. So the difficulty in recruiting an OB that I spoke of a little earlier, that took a long time. We had a couple of people that came in and left in a couple months and didn't work out, before we finally got Dr. Pfaff, who's been there for a couple years now. But if you're trying to recruit surgeons, or if you're trying to recruit a specialist, or you're trying to recruit a family practice doctor, this is what they see, and a young doc that you might want to get into, or a mid-level that you may want to get into the community and keep them there. Are they going to want to stay here, or are they going to want to stay in a new building, a new facility where they can have all the conveniences and good patient flow? So this is a good slide too, because it shows just how old we are. We're more than double what the state and national averages are in terms of age of plant, and that's a combination of just the facility, but also the capital investment that's happened over the years and hasn't happened for us. So we're way behind, and if we don't do something, the question is we fixed some of the things this last year, and we'll be fixing it in 2022 in terms of some of the infrastructure in our building, but that's putting a Band-Aid on it again. And you can see from John's earlier presentation, what we really see in the future is, kind of a long downward spiral if we don't do something. We've got to do something. The economic impact on a rural hospital and its community is pretty big, and it's pretty well known, well documented. We know that if we build a new facility, from the work that John and his team did, we know that in building a new facility, we're going to be able to attract talent, and it starts to have a snowball effect. You start to be able to, people start coming back, and community members start coming back. We're losing, we don't have command of the market the way that other competitors do. We are losing a lot of market share that we think we can capture with a new facility, that we can start bringing that back into the community, keeping in the community. That becomes an economic driver for the community as well. So, we're hitting the vulnerabilities, and we're hitting all of these marks of, that are really red flags for our community and for our hospital. So it really becomes necessary for us to really go down this road of making this change. But like I said, it's tough because there's a lot of political resistance in the community in making a change. So we're just starting that discussion and work right now of how we're going to make this transition and how we're going to explain it to the community and get them on our side. So that we can build a brighter future for the hospital and for the community, the Forks. And this is what we're hoping to get to, something like this. So with that, I think that just about covers it.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to wrap, I've been doing this for going on 22 years now, and we always do debt capacity analysis, and sometimes when those numbers come out and compare it to like a replacement hospital project, the gaps can be significant. I mean, you saw it was $40 to $58 million gap, but never in my 22 years of doing this have I seen a 180 in terms of you saw that they could afford a $78 million hospital if they made that one change. That conversion from long-term care to swing beds was basically completely covered that gap in one change of designation of those beds. And would it have an impact on their capacity for long-term care? Yes, it was probably 2 to 3 patients a year. But what it meant to the hospital in the long run in terms of being able to afford a $78 million facility was just eye-popping for me. That, from my perspective, is a no-brainer, right? Like, those 2 to 3 patients, yeah, because they'll be capped at 25 beds versus right now they have 20 on the long-term care side and like 17 on the acute care side.
Yeah.
But when they combine it all into 25, they'll be seeing those 20 long-term care patients underneath the 25 beds. And as you saw from analysis, they need to leave about 12 or so, 10 or 12 for the acute care side. So the capacity on the long-term care patients would go down, but those patients that were being seen would be in brand new space. You would have much more capacity for acute care, and you would be making a lot more money on the long-term care patients that you would see.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to work with the community on right now and try to educate them on, yes, the long-term care facility is going away, but the patients will still be cared for just under a different bed designation. That is going to allow the community to afford a brand new $70+ million hospital.
Yeah.
So that's what we'd like to leave you with. If you have questions, we're open to them now, but it's something we're still working through. Obviously, I like to call these projects once in a generation. You know, if Paul's successful and the team is successful in building this, that's going to be there for the next 50, 60 years. So we want to make sure and do it right. But it could mean a lot of potential benefit for that community in terms of jobs, revenue, doctors, and quality of care provided.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and just you know, to add a little bit too, you know, I think you know, this process that we've gone through with John and his team has been really good. You know, we knew fragmentary information, but it filled in a lot of gaps, and it pulled in you know, some very vivid things that we didn't know, and you know, really you know, lit a fire under us of what we need to do. So it's been a great experience, you know, going through this and going through this master plan. This is our roadmap for the next, you know, however many years, and what we're going to have to do, and what we're going to have to face, you know, and what we are going to attempt to do. So I think, you know, that for me, you know, you always want to, the accountant in you always wants to have facts and numbers behind what you're doing. Now we do, you know, and now we have something that's, you know, been done objectively as well. So.
Any questions from the group?
Thanks. So maybe actually 2 questions for you. So where are you at now in the process? This is kind of all the work that's been done to get you to this point, and it seems like you're ready to get the funding and issue the debt. So kind of where's that at? And then the second question is, what kind of planning has gone into the building and planning around construction costs? Because as we know, costs of everything have skyrocketed. So this isn't necessarily a quick building. You know, it's going to take 2 to 3 years to build it if you act now. But if it's going to take you a little bit longer, those costs could be, you know, higher than you anticipated, and all of a sudden now you don't have enough money. So what's the contingency plan or stuff like that?
Yeah, well, that is something that worries me. But what we're doing right now is we want to make this conversion in this year, but we've got to get the messaging right with the community and with the board. And then really once we have made the conversion, then we're on the path for the, you know, really the next two, maybe 2.5 years between USDA, all the boxes you've got to check, all the work that's going to need to go into that, you know, from myself and an underwriter to get us there financially, and then getting with architects and getting through, you know, with builders and contractors and all of that. Yeah, we did not start with a you know, here's the building design of what we want. We didn't do that, you know, and John spoke to that, and I think it is important because we had, you know, we could have spent money on that. And gotten some beautiful looking hospital and been, well, we can't do this, you know. You know, so we definitely want to, we know what our numbers are. Can we build it? Yes, I think we can, but if there are heavy inflationary factors that go in over the next couple of years, that might have to scale some stuff back of what we can build. But I think if with having the land is a wonderful gift for us in the way, because we can build it right and build it in a way that, you know, in a thoughtful way of, okay, when this needs to be replaced 50, 60 years, or when you need to add on to it, how do we do it in a way that isn't disruptive and doesn't lock us in the way the current hospital is locked in?
That's a good question on the inflation, because as we did the cost estimated, we were pretty conservative, and meaning putting higher cost per square foot. I think we used $660 per square foot for hospital, just knowing that it's going to be probably higher, when they eventually get in. But we'd rather err on the high side than be too low. So, I mean, when I first started doing this, it was $450 per square foot for hospital square footage build, eye occupancy. 20 years later, we're talking about $650 per square foot. I mean, that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And how much it grows. And I only anticipate it to continue going upwards. And especially, they're more expensive because they're in Forks,
Yep.
and it's harder to get to, and that all adds costs to that construction.
Yeah, and that's been a challenge just in dealing with the HVAC, and of course we've got to worked with Train on that, but they handle the subcontractors, and there have been gaps, there have been people getting sick, there have been contractors that they lost and had to get new ones. It's difficult because of where we're at.
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks everybody, appreciate it.
Thank you very much.